Okay, so today we are going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, the adrenal medulla, and then cerebral blood flow, CSF fluid, and brain metabolism. In this first video, I'm going to address the general structure and function of the autonomic nervous system. Here are your learning objectives, and we'll address these throughout the lecture. And then, just like I've said in the previous lectures, is if I talk about it, especially if I go into details about something, that's for sure fair game for the exam, for exam questions. If I don't touch on it at all or specifically say you need to know this, then it's additional information on the slide to help you understand, but won't be required for the actual exam questions. All right, so you've seen something similar to this in my previous lecture about the divisions of the nervous system. The two main branches are going to be the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, and then we have the peripheral nervous system, which is composed of cranial nerves and spinal nerves. That peripheral, so central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, and then the PNS can be further subdivided into the somatic nervous system, which when we talked about the neuromuscular junction, and we didn't go into somatic senses, but the neuromuscular junction, that skeletal muscle, that's part of the somatic nervous system. And then today we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system, which can be further subdivided into sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Now, this is an oversimplification of how to think about these two subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. But the sympathetic, you think fight or flight. So these are going to be pathways that are elicited in a fight or flight response, as far as responses to stress and survival. And then the parasympathetic division branch is going to be, it's again an oversimplification, but rest and digest. So it's going to elicit activities during restful states, and we'll address some of those functions later on. But know that both of these pathways are working continuously. It's just if we are in a fight or flight situation, the sympathetic would be fully activated. Okay. All right, so autonomic nervous system. The centers that control the autonomic nervous system are located if you remember back in the previous lecture when I talked about some of those subcortical regions, and I mentioned the hypothalamus and how it is a major brain area that's going to be involved in maintaining body homeostasis, and it does so by controlling the autonomic nervous system. So of course we're going to mention the hypothalamus here, and in the brain stem, especially the medulla oblongata, we'll see that the vagus nerve comes off of the medulla oblongata, and then also centers in the spinal cord. The autonomic nervous system, think it's in the name, autonomic. It is all of the functions that you don't have to consciously think about, right? So arterial blood pressure, GI secretions and motility, urinary bladder emptying, sweating, body temperature regulation. Those are all things that happen automatically without conscious effort or control, right? So it controls all of visceral functions. And then again, the two major branches of the autonomic nervous system is the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay. All right, so the general organization for both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system is that we are going to have what's called a preganglionic neuron, and you'll understand why it's called preganglionic in just a second. But the preganglionic neurons are going to arise from the spinal cord or from the brainstem, if you'll see in the case of the parasympathetic branch. But our preganglionic neurons are going to originate from the brainstem or the spinal cord. They're going to exit through spinal nerves, and then they're going to synapse in a specialized structure called a ganglion. Ganglion, anatomically, the anatomical definition of this is just a cluster of cell bodies kind of outside of the central nervous system. So these are going to be located in tissue outside of the CNS, and that preganglionic neuron is going to come and synapse within the ganglion on a post-ganglionic neuron, right? So post-ganglionic neuron, and then it's that post-ganglionic neuron that's going to then go and synapse on effector cells that will carry out the response for the ANS. Okay, so you'll see this general structure in both parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions. All right, so let's address learning objective number 2. So let's go into a little more detail about the sympathetic, the distribution of the sympathetic nerve fibers. So you're going to see sympathetic nerve fibers, the preganglionic neurons are going to originate from the spinal cord in segments T1 through L2. So T is referring to thoracic, that's going to be the thoracic region of the spinal cord, to L2, which is the lumbar region of the spinal cord, right? So here, up here, brain, spinal cord, T1 through L2, all of these guys are preganglionic neurons arising from those levels of the spinal cord. And then they're going to go out, and very quickly they're going to enter a specialized structure called it's a sympathetic chain ganglion. So it's just, we talked about ganglions are masses of cell bodies located outside of the CNS. Well, this is just a specialized structure of a chain. It's an interconnected network of ganglia, and it allows for these fibers, these preganglionic fibers, to potentially travel up or down so that they can exit at different levels to go to different, to synapse with postganglionic fibers at different levels, okay? So it's just this, it's the same thing. It's a cluster of cell bodies. It's an interconnected network. So some of these preganglionic fibers will synapse in the chain ganglia. Others might go and synapse on postganglionic fibers within these collateral ganglia. And then some will go straight to an organ, and I'll address that in just a second. All right, so that's the distribution of the sympathetic nerve fibers. And then once it synapses with a postganglionic neuron in the ganglia, right, those postganglionic neurons are then going to exit the ganglia and go innervate effector organs, okay? And this is just highlighting that again. It's just a more simplified image over here. And here's our spinal cord. This would be segments T1 through L2. Here's our preganglionic nerve fibers. They're going to exit the spinal cord. Then they're going to go synapse with a postganglionic nerve fiber, either in the sympathetic chain ganglia or a collateral ganglion, right? Or in the case of the adrenal medulla, so you might look at this image and be like, well, this preganglionic neuron is coming and synapsing straight in the adrenal medulla. There's no postganglionic nerve fiber. What the heck, right? And the reason for this is because the adrenal medulla, the cells within the adrenal medulla are actually modified postganglionic neurons. So the adrenal medulla itself is a postganglionic structure, right? It's the adrenal medulla cells, adrenal medullary cells, that are going to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine directly into the bloodstream. So this is just a specialized structure, okay? So it's like an exception to all the other pre- and postganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. All right, so let's see how the distribution of the parasympathetic nerve fibers, how they differ from the sympathetic. All right, so remember, the sympathetic nerve fibers arise from the spinal cord through segments T1 through L2. Well, in the parasympathetic nervous branch of the ANS, we're going to have parasympathetic preganglionic nerve fibers originating from the brainstem, so cranial nerves, as well as the sacral segment of the spinal cord. So it's cranial sacral. All right. So in the cranial segment, we have cranial nerves 3, which is ocular motor, 7, which is facial, 9, glossopharyngeal, and then 10, vagus. I'm not going to expect you to memorize all of these, but for the only one that I want you to for sure know is cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus nerve. And it's because if we follow cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve, you'll see that it innervates lots of internal organs, right? So about 75% of all parasympathetic nerve fibers are contained within the vagus nerve. So it's a large component of the parasympathetic nervous system. And if you look, so the vagus nerve is originating from the brainstem, and it's going to innervate visceral organs like the heart and the GI system. So what I want you to do is pause for a second and go back to the previous lecture when I talked about the organization of the central nervous system. There were some subcortical or lower brain regions that you needed to be familiar with their functions. So I want you to go back, look at those subcortical regions, and then tell me which one you think the vagus nerve is arising from. And I actually think I accidentally said that earlier in the lecture. Okay. Hopefully, when you went back and looked, you came up with, based on the functions of the medulla oblongata, that you now know that the vagus nerve is connected to the medulla oblongata. Okay? All right. So where these preganglionic parasympathetic nerve fibers arise is different from the sympathetic nervous system. Cranial, sacral. Okay? And the big guy here is that vagus nerve innervate, which contains about 75% of all parasympathetic nerve fibers. Now, looking at another thing that you might notice by looking at this image is that there's no chain ganglia here. We don't have that with the parasympathetic nervous system. We have preganglionic neurons, nerve fibers that are going to leave the cranial or sacral regions, and they are going to exit, and they are still going to synapse in a ganglion, but there's no chain ganglion here, okay? These ganglia are located closer to the tissues themselves, all right? And so they're going to synapse, the preganglionic neurons are going to synapse in a ganglion with a postsynaptic or a postganglionic neuron, which will then go innervate effector tissues and cells, all right? Let's see. And then terminal ganglia or intramural ganglia, those are just different names referring to the ganglia of the parasympathetic nervous system. All right? And so just kind of comparing and contrasting some of the structural differences between sympathetic and parasympathetic. I remember the sympathetic preganglionic nerve fibers are located between T1 and L2, whereas in the parasympathetic, we have preganglionic neurons arising from the brainstem. Those are those cranial nerves. Big player is cranial nerve 10, which is the vagus, and then the spinal cord, but in the sacral region, S2 through S4. The site of the ganglia are different. So in the sympathetic, we have a sympathetic chain ganglia, which is that specialized interconnected network of ganglia, allowing for fibers to travel up and down if needed. We have some ganglia located in the periphery, those collateral ganglia, and then that adrenal medulla acts as a specialized, modified the cells of the adrenal medulla act as a modified postganglionic neurons. And then with the parasympathetic nervous system, the ganglia are located much closer to the tissues in which the postganglionic neurons are going to innervate. All right, so because the sympathetic chain ganglia and the sympathetic nervous system is located very close to the spinal cord itself, the preganglionic fibers of the sympathetic nervous system are relatively short because they're just going to go straight to the chain ganglia, which is right next to the spinal cord. So those preganglionic fibers are short. But then the postganglionic fibers are going to be long because they have to travel from the sympathetic chain ganglia all the way to the tissues in which they innervate. But in the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic fibers are going to be relatively long because they're going to go all the way to those ganglia, which are located closer to the tissues themselves. And then the postganglionic fibers, which are going to go from the ganglion to the tissues, well, the ganglion's already near the tissue, so those postganglionic fibers are going to be relatively short. So those are just some structural differences. All right, so let's address learning objective 3 now. All right, so which neurotransmitters are going to come into play with the autonomic nervous system? So up here we have our sympathetic pathway, and down here we have our parasympathetic pathway. And if you were to not even look at the labels, you could, based on what we just talked about with the structural differences, you could tell me which ones are sympathetic and which one is the sympathetic and parasympathetic pathway. So here, this is the CNS, whether it's spinal cord or the the brainstem region, right? If you look, our preganglionic neuron up here is relatively short. So that should give you an indication that we're talking about the sympathetic pathway, because it's going to go and synapse in that interconnected sympathetic chain ganglia, which is really close to the spinal cord itself, right? And then we have long postganglionic fibers, because they have to travel from the sympathetic chain ganglia all the way to the tissues. Here in the parasympathetic pathway, we have long preganglionic fibers, because they have to travel to the ganglia, which is located right next to the tissues or within the tissues that they're going to innervate. And then the postganglionic fibers are pretty short, because they're already like right there in the tissues, okay? And then this would be the effector or the target tissue. All right, in both cases, the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic pathways, you'll notice that it's all color-coded to make it a little bit easier, but our preganglionic neurons, they're both purple. They're both cholinergic preganglionic neurons. Cholinergic meaning that they are going to secrete the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, okay? You should be very familiar with acetylcholine already based on our neuromuscular junction lecture. And acetylcholine is a small molecule neurotransmitter. And acetylcholine is going to bind to receptors on the postganglionic neurons, and these receptors are nicotinic receptors. I say that now. I'll discuss it a little more in detail in just a second. But these are excitatory receptors. They are going to cause the postganglionic neurons to fire action potentials, okay? Now, where the difference comes in is going to be the type of neurotransmitter that the postganglionic neurons secrete. Let's look at the parasympathetic pathway first. Our postganglionic neuron is also purple. It is also a cholinergic neuron, meaning that the postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system will also secrete acetylcholine. But instead of binding to nicotinic receptors, which are always excitatory, this acetylcholine will bind to what's called muscarinic receptors on the target tissue. And I'll go into a little more detail in just a second. Okay, but these are going to be different acetylcholine receptors. They're going to be metabotropic, whereas the nicotinic receptors, they are ionotropic. I'm using terms from our previous lecture. The muscarinic receptors are metabotropic. All right, so both preganglionic and postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic pathway secrete acetylcholine, but the receptors are different. Now, up in the sympathetic pathway, remember our preganglionic neuron is cholinergic. It's going to secrete acetylcholine, but our postganglionic neuron, this is an adrenergic neuron, meaning it's going to secrete epinephrine or norepinephrine. Okay? It's going to secrete norepinephrine. The reason why it's called an adrenergic neuron is because the old names for norepinephrine and epinephrine was noradrenaline and adrenaline. So adrenergic adrenaline. All right, so again, just repeating myself, is this in the sympathetic pathway, the postganglionic neuron is an adrenergic neuron. It will secrete norepinephrine, and it's going to bind to either alpha or beta receptors on the target tissue. And depending on which receptors are present on the target tissue will determine the response of that target tissue. Okay? Now, with those postganglionic neurons, this should somewhat look familiar to you when we talked about in our smooth muscle lecture. But instead of having that typical synaptic terminal coming down and innervating and forming a synapse with one cell on the postsynaptic side, what we see with the majority of both parasympathetic and sympathetic nerve fibers, postganglionic nerve fibers, is that rather than having just like a synaptic terminal going and innervating one cell, we have these structures called varicosities. And so that term we talked about in smooth muscle, but we have these like bulbous structures along the length of the axon. And each of these bulbous structures, these varicosities, contain neurotransmitter vesicles and lots of mitochondria. And then we have secretion of the neurotransmitter along all of these varicosities. Okay, and then the neurotransmitter just diffuses across the extracellular space to the target tissue. Right? So that's what the synapses are going to look like. This, I pretty much already discussed this in a little bit of detail in the previous slide, so I'm not going to hit on it. I'm not going to go over this a lot right now because I've already talked about it, but again, in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic pathways, our preganglionic neurons are both cholinergic, and they're going to secrete acetylcholine in the ganglia. That acetylcholine is then going to bind to nicotinic receptors on both of the postganglionic neurons. These nicotinic receptors are ionotropic, meaning that acetylcholine's effects are going to be on ion channels. They're excitatory receptors, so it's going to cause both postganglionic neurons to fire action potentials. Now the difference comes in the postganglionic neurons. In our sympathetic pathway, our postganglionic neurons are adrenergic receptors. They're going to secrete norepinephrine. And the norepinephrine neurotransmitter will bind to either alpha or beta adrenergic receptors on the target tissue. Whereas the postganglionic neuron of the parasympathetic pathway is going to also be a cholinergic neuron. It's going to secrete acetylcholine neurotransmitter, and that's going to bind to a different type of acetylcholine receptor called the muscarinic receptors. These are metabotropic. Alpha beta adrenergic receptors, they're all metabotropic as well. Okay, so this acetylcholine is going to bind to muscarinic metabotropic receptors on the target tissue and elicit their response that way. All right, so with acetylcholine can bind to nicotinic receptors, which are always located at within the ganglion between the pre- and postganglionic neurons of both pathways. And then muscarinic receptors are located on the target tissue of the parasympathetic pathway. Here I just want to highlight a few, not that you have to know this entire table by any means, but just where the nicotinic versus the muscarinic receptors are located. The fact that the nicotinic receptors, which are located in between the pre- and post-ganglionic neuron, they're always excitatory, so they're ionotropic, meaning so ligand-gated ion channels. They're going to open ion channels and cause those postganglionic neurons to fire action potentials. Whereas the muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are G-protein coupled receptors. Using our terms from our previous lecture, those are metabotropic receptors. Okay, G-protein coupled receptors, they're metabotropic. And then depending upon the type of, if you remember back, I think it may have been the first lecture, when we discussed how can acetylcholine and norepinephrine have both excitatory and inhibitory effects, and I said that it depends on the receptor that it's binding to. Well, there are different muscarinic metabotropic receptors. Some can cause excitatory responses, whereas other muscarinic receptors can cause inhibitory responses. So it depending upon which muscarinic receptor is located at that target tissue will determine the effects of acetylcholine from the postganglionic neuron on that target tissue. So it all comes down to which receptors are present will determine the types of responses we get. And then adrenergic receptors, remember, here's our sympathetic pathway. The preganglionic neuron is cholinergic, secretes acetylcholine, which will bind to the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which are ionotropic. On the postganglionic neuron, which is always excitatory, action potentials get sent down this adrenergic postganglionic neuron, which will secrete norepinephrine. And then norepinephrine will bind to either alpha or beta adrenergic receptors on the target tissue. And then same thing, depending upon which receptor, is it alpha or beta, and there's also beta 1, beta 2, depending upon which adrenergic receptor is present on that target tissue will determine the response at the target tissue, right? Something to be aware of is the fact that all of the adrenergic receptors are metabotropic, so they're G protein coupled receptors. All right, and remember, you should think back to the previous lecture, is that when you have metabotropic receptors, you get far-reaching, you get an amplified second messenger response, and you get far-reaching changes within the entire cell, right? Because you're affecting protein transcription, translation, all of that kind of stuff. Let's see, what else do I want to say from this? I won't ask this per se, but just be aware that epinephrine, which is going to be primarily produced and released by the adrenal medulla, can excite both types of receptors, both alpha and beta, whereas norepinephrine has more of a response on the alpha receptors, but I won't ask that. And then I just put this little table down here so you can see that, just like we saw previously with the cholinergic receptors, is that depending upon which receptor gets bound, that will determine the response. Okay? And let's see. All right, so this is just a nice little summary of everything that I just talked about. So you can look at this on your own. This is another image showing you what I've repeated in the last couple of slides. So you can look over this to help you understand. And then the functions of the autonomic nervous system, I'm not going to go through all of these. I want you on your own to look over what some of the responses are. So if the parasympathetic pathway is activated, what kinds of responses would we get? And if you think about it logically, if you think parasympathetic, rest and digest, well, when you're resting and digesting, you would be, increased saliva production, normalizes breathing, decreases heart rate, increases gastric acid production and pancreatic digestive enzyme production, increases peristalsis for digestion, all those kinds of things. Whereas if the sympathetic nervous system is activated and sympathetic is fight or flight, well, what kinds of things would you need to happen in a fight or flight response to stress situation? We'd want to increase heart rate. We would want to increase respiratory rate. We don't need to be digesting if we're trying to flee a stressful situation, et cetera, et cetera. So if I were to have a multiple choice question on the test about this, you should be able to identify, some of the functions or what would happen in response to the parasympathetic or the sympathetic nervous system branches being activated. And then that's it. That's the end of this first video. I will address the other learning objectives in the next video.